Let's open up these notes. All right, everyone. So this is the patch breakdown for patch 1.18, and we are all set up. There have been a ton of changes, and I thought I'd leave this up since it seems like a pretty good visual representation of everything that's going on. So we have like a lot of different changes, and I'm going to go over each of them in turn. We're going to talk about all the different cards that have changed. And yeah, it should be pretty cool. The current list is in alphabetical order. There's also a bunch of like bug fixes and client fixes. I guess we'll talk about those last. Let's talk about the cards first, because the cards first are pretty exciting, and also because we have the cards up right now. Okay, so there were a big swath of changes, a lot of which look to be, you know, sort of influence-based changes, trying to get some decks to perform a little bit better as like 2-color or 1-color decks, and basically move people out of sort of the 3-color good stuff mush that often becomes, you know, like the Armory deck and some other types of decks where they have like just a lot of just good stuff thrown into a deck because they can very easily splash it. So there's been some influence changes. And first of those is that a Zindel's Gift now costs 3 Shadow Influence instead of 1 Shadow Influence. This is a change that I heartily agree with. I think that it's really nice because the Zindel's Gift was kind of being zonked into any control deck. Like, even if you were 3 colors, you just splash a Shadow Sigil and a Zindel's Gift because you could run Celestial Omen for it. You just seek power for that Shadow and then you pick it out. You play a Zindel's Gift, and it's a very powerful Shadow effect, of course, for 7. It's a really good card to be playing at 7. If you don't make it this deep in influence, then it becomes a card that becomes fairly ubiquitous in the control archetype. And it's also a card that shuts down the control archetype very heavily. Like, it actually is very actively bad for the control archetype that this card exists, since this card is specifically hate for the slower types of decks, and it's just so good if any other control deck is running it, that it kind of made it really necessary to have that splash, which wasn't really a, you know, a terribly fun design. Zindel's Gift is a really cool change. I'm really glad about that one. The next big one is Champion of Chaos, which, yep, has been changed to give +1 attack or +1 strength, but no health. So the Champion of Chaos now becomes a 5/3, and from there we have basically the ability to, it still does the same amount of damage that it did before. It's got Overwhelm and Deadly, so it can splash over and do that 4 damage apiece, but it doesn't necessarily have that same amount of survivability. It now dies to Torch, it now dies to trading with cards like Seraph, it dies to a lot of different things. Now, Champion of Chaos was always a card that you only ever needed to hit people with once, but the main thing that was especially problematic about it was that it was something that, you know, at 5, you could, at 5 health, if you played it on curve, it was just really impossibly hard to deal with. There were not very good answers to it. And yeah, like, we are super excited to see this Geral Bruise. Yeah, we'll be doing Geral Bruise Pass. Okay, so Champion of Chaos, I think this is a really markedly good change. It's not going to change Champion of Chaos as a staple card in those Chaos decks, but it will make Stonescar decks a little bit less ubiquitous, and it should make it so that, like, you don't just fill this slot immediately and like have a much better deck as a result. I think that this card will definitely allow you to continue to push damage the way that you've been pushing damage, but now that it's a little bit more killable, it should make for more interesting matchups. And I think it'll also make a more interesting Stonescar versus Stonescar matchup, because now that Stonescar decks can torch each other's Champion of Chaos, that means that you have a few less of those cards that are problematically coming down on 2 or 3 that just decide the game. Like, typically the Stonescar matchup was whoever drew the Champion of Chaos first wins. Now that's not the case, and that's really interesting. Champion of Wisdom actually got a buff, so there's been some effort to make primal cards better. Champion of Wisdom is now a 4/4, and the ability now gives +2/+2, so it's still effectively a 6/6 if you play it on 4 time, but you can play it a little more reliably now on 4 if you don't have that influence. And that's, you know, a good, like, simple reliability change. We've seen a change like this before in some of the card patch notes. I don't remember specifically which one it was, but it was that idea that if you can give something a bonus like that, it's easier to have it like have a bit of higher health to begin with, and then just lower the influence bonus to compensate. And that ends up working out pretty well for Champion of Wisdom. Champion of Wisdom is now like a card that, yeah, should be pretty fun and reliable. It'll be still a really good card in mid-range decks. I can see this card helping Elysian mid-range decks come back into the fold, and I'm really actually looking forward to playing some Elysian mid-range decks. There's some really cool mid-range cards out there, and I'm looking forward to seeing them. All right, Cobalt Monument now transforms into a 4/4 instead of a 3/4. For draft decks, this is a huge improvement. For ranked decks, this may be a bit of a stealth nerf. The Jotun Hurler was the card that went from 3/4 to 4/4 previously, and it went from a card that I played fairly frequently to a card that I just didn't play very much at all. This is now vulnerable to Vanquish is the main thing here. Having it have extra attack does increase its clock, and that's definitely something that's pretty threatening, especially on an evasive unit like Cobalt Monument, which is why I think Cobalt Monument does actually get a buff here. On a card like Jotun Hurler, it was specifically a stealth nerf. Like, it was something that like just really ended up making it less survivable and less capable as a blocker, and Jotun Hurler was a card that really wanted to block and defend. Cobalt Monument plays more in an aggressive style, and it plays well as a sort of finisher in a control deck that doesn't want to run a lot of units, so I think this is actually a pretty good change to the card and should give it a decent buff. Okay, here's probably the biggest change that I've seen made. Crownwatch Paladin is now a 2/1. So 1 less health on Crownwatch Paladin does not change its survivability as much as you would think. That Aegis is still in effect. It still needs to be double torched by a lot of things. You still have to do like Levitate and Navara's Favor, things like that. You still have to spend 2 spells and like do a lot of other things going on. Yeah, this highlight effect's really cool, isn't it, Dahamugo? Yeah, so like this is really interesting. I think that overall it should make Bracano decks just a little bit less reliable. I don't think it's going to make a huge difference. Like, this is another thing where like that amount of tempo, the war cries that you're building, like Crownwatch Paladin is still going to be a star card, but that 1 health may make quite a bit of a difference. And in terms of like it being able to trade with, it can no longer just trade evenly with a Grenadin drone. It could make some token decks a little bit better, mainly the slow token decks. And that's actually what we're going to be seeing a lot of in patch 1.18, is this sort of like slow down and like attempt to make slow decks a little bit more valuable and aggro decks a little bit less valuable. So it's pretty cool. Yeah, we're pretty excited about Crownwatch Paladin. Explorer Emeritus. I like this change a lot. Explorer Emeritus has 1 more health. Not a big deal, but Explorer Emeritus, Staff of Stories is receiving a nerf this patch, so Explorer Emeritus is actually a card that might come back into the forefront as an alternate Staff of Stories effect. It's a pretty fun card to defend. It's actually got a really cool ability. There's a lot of cool things that you can do with it. I like Explorer a lot, and I think that giving it a little bit of extra survivability so it doesn't just die to like an offhand Vara's Favor actually does improve the card tremendously. Like, this card was already pretty solid. It's a very good draft bomb, and now that it doesn't die just straight to 1 hits from Black Sky Harbinger and Vara's Favor, that's actually like 2 very crucial spells that it needs to not have to die to. So yeah, this is a big improvement to this card. It's already a hybrid colored card. I've talked a lot about how those cards are harder to destroy. They require more effort, more investment. You typically have to death strike them. So like, yeah, this card is pretty cool. I think that it'll be a little bit more, that improvement definitely does help a lot. Talking about Skelly Greon, we will talk about Skelly Greon, but we'll talk about like Dino decks in particular when we get to that one on the list, Wodar. All right, Frontier Jito. This was a pretty big one. Frontier Jito is now a 1/1 that costs 2. So there's still some interesting plays that can be made with this, but it definitely does really hamper the Jito decks. Now the Jito decks are going to be basically fast aggro decks that run a lot of 1/1s just so that they can stay down and stay low on the curve. Jito decks don't necessarily need Jito to win, but all of their like incredibly insane bomb draws that were just unbeatable typically involve Jito. And now Jito is actually kind of a poor investment that like doesn't really come down at a time that you particularly want it to come down. I think that I think that Jito might just come out of Jito decks, and Jito decks won't suffer too much for it. It will slow down Jito a little bit, and it'll make mid-range and control a lot more viable. I think just this card going away, or this card having a nerf, like this is clearly one of those situations where Jito is not a card that maybe is going to be played a lot much more, but you might still see it. And if you do still see it, it'll be in very specific decks that are like trying to accomplish that particular Jito thing. Whereas like most of the aggro decks will just be a little bit more aggro. Yeah, I think I really like this nerf. This is really good for the meta. This is the biggest buff to Primal that there is in the patch. People were really asking for a buff to Primal, and this is the biggest one. Like, there are a lot of these changes, the Crownwatch Paladin change and the Jito change, both really improve the standing of Feln and the standing of Primal decks and the standing of anything slow to mid-range. Like, there is a definite increase in that viability, and I think that that's something that's really exciting about this patch, because it's going to make a lot of interesting wonk and jank stuff possible, and it's going to make just, I think, the game a lot more fun to play. So I'm excited about Jito getting nerfed. I never really liked Jito decks. They were always one of my least favorite decks to run. It's not that they're difficult, it's not that they're like skill-less, they're just not very fun to me. So yeah, it's interesting, and you know, the really hyper fast archetype is getting a little bit of a nerf, and I think that's a pretty good thing. I don't think it's going to lose complete competitive viability, but I think that this is probably the card nerf that most actually takes a card out of the running as a standard staple. Crownwatch Paladin is still going to be sticking around, but Frontier Jito's probably going away for a while, or maybe not going to be seen in nearly as large a number. Okay, Geral Iceheart, now a 6/7 instead of a 6/6. So we have the design notes on these patches, and we already know that the idea behind this is to make it a little bit less vulnerable to fire effects like Flame Blast and Obliterate. And having a 6-drop that is not vulnerable to those effects is actually a pretty good thing. I think that as a mid-range card, this is a really interesting decision. I'm really excited about it because I have a Geral Iceheart build, a mid-range Geral Iceheart build that I'm really excited to play tonight. And I don't know if I have enough Geral Icehearts, but I'm really excited to do it because, yeah, I think that this extra point of stats does actually put Geral in the running for a really decent mid-range archetype. This card also no longer dies to Predatory Carnosaur, which means that he's kind of a mid-range beater that actually counters most of the mid-range cards. He's still no good against Cerso, but he survives Sandstorm Titan, he survives Predatory Carnosaur, he survives all of the 6/6s and all of the, like, you know, like fairly large stuff. So Iceheart's going to be able to stick around for the extra turn that he needs most of the time to get that flying effect or get that Trickster's Cloak or get that Levitate and then get across and do something fun with his Infiltrate, which is an effect that he just never gets to see, and I'm very excited about it. I think this is especially exciting for blue, purple, red combo decks because Iceheart actually fits really well into that combo. He gets to draw the top spell of your deck. If that spell is like a mirror image or something, then you can just cast it on a Calderon Channeler and then do it again. And if it's another mirror image or a Strength of the Pack, you can just keep doing that. And in the meantime, you're also just bombing your opponent's board. So yeah, that's pretty exciting. Really neat. I like this change. People thought it wasn't enough to make Geral Iceheart all that interesting, but I think that it is, yeah, definitely on the upper side. Sorry guys, that's my phone. Let me turn the notifications off. There we go. Okay, so yeah, next up is Skelly Greon. This one's kind of exciting. Skelly Greon's now a 1/4. Now, stat-wise, this is still not a terribly efficient creature. You'll recall that like a 2/3 is still a pretty good stat line, and that's what you get on Bold Adventurer. The green card is like a 3/2, so like having a stat that is 4 is actually really relevant. Like, this card actually does do the job that it promises, which is it is a kind of turtley card that is actually fairly hard to kill. So the cost reduction is a big deal, and I think this card will actually see play in some dinosaur decks. It's another nerf to the Jito. It's another way that blue decks can get some defenders down that are actually really quite difficult to kill and play around Rakano decks a little bit more, get a little bit more of a setup going on. This is pretty good in the mid-range archetype. It's kind of cool in the dinosaur deck. I think that it is pretty solid. As Wodar was saying, the Waykeeper, Borderlands Waykeeper, is definitely a really good card for exactly the same purpose, but it's nice that blue now has 2 units that can stand and just sort of defend the early game so that they can like set up more for the late game. I think that's a pretty cool change. I'm interested to see how this card plays out and whether or not it becomes useful in Standard. These kind of defensive cards are really hard to evaluate because they don't have any pressure. So like they don't have a way to win the game on their own. That's usually, but not always, a sign that they're not going to see a lot of play. Like, if you play down a card and it's effectively dead weight, like you end up in a control versus control matchup, or like just ends up being like up against a mid-range deck and he doesn't care. Like, if it doesn't do anything except against aggro decks, that may be pretty scary. In dinosaur decks, this can become like a 3/6 as soon as you have that Abyssor Patriarch down and you buff all your dinosaurs. And in decks that run like Xenon Obelisk and other things, actually getting this thing bigger is really, really good. So if you have any sort of passive buffs, then this card is pretty cool. And if you're just trying to defend your early game, this card is pretty cool. I don't know about his power level yet. I think that it's definitely a good upgrade to sort of popper decks, and I think that's another theme that we're seeing in 1.18, is that a lot of the cheaper decks are getting actually really substantive buffs, and some really good changes on those fronts are really going to help out early games for like people who are running slow control decks that are cheap, people who are running slow mid-range decks that are cheap, people who are running just basically like all sorts of interesting stuff like that. And that actually will get us into Thunderstrike Dragon. But first, Soulfire Drake. Soulfire Drake has gone up to 3 red. We might as well cover Umbran Reaper in the same breath. Soulfire Drake now costs 3 red influence, and Umbran Reaper also costs 3 purple influence. The cards have not changed otherwise. They're just very, very deep in their colors now. Both of them used to be double red and double purple, so this is a small nerf. It's a pretty good nerf, I would say, to both cards, since neither one was particularly on the strong side, but they both felt very strong. And they also were very, very emblematic of their colors. Umbran Reaper is an extremely good purple card that shows off a lot of purple archetypes, that sort of like suicidal nature, the lifesteal, the fun entomb, the kind of difficult decisions that it forces you to make. So like, it's totally fine that this card is up into the later influence. And I believe it says in the notes that part of this is setting up so that you have like a little bit less of a mush deck. It's also nice because Stonescar decks were running both of these as finishers, both this and Obliterate and the Soulfire Drake all at once. And I was actually like starting to move away from this in my lists. I do think that it was a very, very strong decision, but now you're pretty much going to have to pick one or the other, and you're going to have to favor a color a little bit. I think that's okay. I think that's actually going to support some decent gameplay, and it's a fine minor nerf to Stonescar, which is good because Stonescar was very, very dominant in the last couple of tournaments, so it'll be interesting to see if this changes things up a little bit. I think the Stonescar changes don't negate Stonescar decks as a tournament presence, but I think that they will make it less appealing, and in so reduce its popularity, which is good because it's slightly on the strong side, but it's mostly just extremely popular. So yeah, that's pretty cool. Flying aggro with new Windshaper. I feel okay about it, Wodar. Yeah, I think it's gonna be a thing. And there's new Windshaper. Okay, what's next? So, Soulfire Drake, Spire Chaplain. Oh man, I'm so happy about this one. I'm sorry, I'm just really happy about this one. I like Spire Chaplain a lot. This is one of my favorite cards, and I've wanted it to have more health for a long time. I think I may have specifically submitted this request, that Spire Chaplain get an extra point of health. It wasn't a very competitive rate for its card. Spire Chaplain is an intense card advantage card. It's actually really, really good at drawing you a ton of extra power and getting you some really cool plays. Now that it has that extra point of survivability, I think it's well on the chain to setting up some cool mid-range archetypes. And I'm the hugest. I'm a big supporter of Rakano mid-range and of like just green mid-range in general. I think that like those are really fun decks. I always wanted to make Coup de Grace work. I really liked 5-power Navani. Every time that cards have gone out of Rakano mid-range, I've been very sad because Rakano had a lot of mid-range options before, and it just wasn't very good at getting to them. Spire Chaplain is one of those cards that allows you to get to them. So this is another card that makes cards like Jack really interesting. It's another card that makes cards like Plated Demolisher, but Plated Demolisher is, Plated Demolisher. Just in general, like the slow Rakano fun cards. I think Spire Chaplain is really cool at getting to them. And it's also pretty good in like some armory archetypes. It's good at drawing you cards. It's just a fancy card, and I'm really excited that it's actually in a position where I can see play. Because it wasn't good enough, and now it is, I think. So yeah, really, really fun, really, really fun. Oh my goodness. Yeah, somebody blocked a Crown Notch Paladin with Skelly Greon in draft. That's pretty good. Yeah, Skelly Greon's gonna be doing some good stuff. Alright, so Staff of Stories, now a 0/4 instead of a 0/5. This one I think is entirely deserved, actually. As much as Primal is not like a terribly strong setup, Staff of Stories is a good splash that was not risky enough. Like this card drew a lot of cards, and basically like you couldn't punish it hard enough because it essentially just gained you 5 life no matter what, and most of the time it would draw you at least 1 card because it was so big and so hard to kill. This requires you to set up staffs a little more carefully. It's not that big of a nerf to it, but it does mean that like if your opponent is really dedicated, he can usually take the staff down on the turn that you play it, which isn't going to be good for your game plan. Staff of Stories might see a little bit less play as a result of this. I think that's fine. It was kind of a toxic, but not necessarily a toxic card. I think it was definitely unfun for newbies to play against in particular. I'm still excited by this card. I still think it's a card that you play with and you have a lot of fun with and do a lot of the same things with. I think that your opponent has more responses to it now, and that's fair. Did I talk about the Explorer Emeritus? Yes, I did, and I'm quite delighted by Explorer Emeritus. I like that he has that extra point of health. Okay. Steward of the Past. 4 Shadow instead of... Okay, yeah, this one is 2 extra Shadow influence, or 1 extra Shadow influence. So, you know, a little bit deeper into Shadow, which it probably should be. It's definitely another one of those cards that's pretty emblematic of Shadow. You know, this card is very, very strong and always has been a good card. It's mostly good at keeping decks honest, so, like, this kind of nerf doesn't really, like, reduce the power of Shadow at all. It doesn't like reduce the power of Steward at doing its job. It just makes it slightly less likely that you're going to want him in your deck. And you know, for the most part, I think this is okay. Like if you slightly reduce the amount of Stewards of the Past in the world, then you definitely increase the amount of jank and weird stuff. And like that's you know, like once again, this patch seems themed around making more interesting decks viable by making sure that you can't just like mush up all of the good cards and just do that. I think it's a really interesting shakeup. So yeah, pretty excited about Steward. Subvert is also double Shadow. This one saddens me a little, but it is another card that again is fairly emblematic of Shadow. Totally fine that it's double Shadow. It's not actually that difficult to splash. It does mean you have to be a little bit deeper into Shadow to be using that to draw cards from your hand, but you were already gonna be deep in Shadow if you're using Subvert to get card advantage as opposed to Wisdom of the Elders or Ancient Lore or other things like that. So like this card definitely fine, totally legitimate nerf. Seems pretty cool. Thunderstrike Dragon, now a 5/6 instead of a 5/5. This card is now capable of blocking Sandstorm Titan, and that's actually a pretty big deal because Sandstorm Titan was one of the reasons why it wouldn't be played. It's also, you know, like a fun, cheaper card that like definitely helps out newbies. In the design notes, I think they specifically state this one as being like something to help out newbies, or like, you know, like something to help out people who have like who are building their early like dinosaur decks and things like that. Or maybe that was one of the other patch notes, but one of the other notes that they mentioned. But yeah, this is like, you know, one of those cards that is actually a really cool card to have early, a good rare to have early, and now its rate is actually really competitive with its influence cost. This card is a very, very fun echo card, so it's a lot of fun to play. I think the extra point of health definitely does make it pretty nasty. It's also even more of a bomb in draft. Like, this card was already just disgusting in draft, and now it can basically do anything. It's really, really good. Oh, it can also block Ikaria. Overmaster has a very good point. There are a lot of 5/5 units that cost 7 that are not going to be too happy about Thunderstrike Dragon just sort of standing in their way. This card is, you know, hard as heck to remove. I think that this overall rate increase just gives it so many more ways to stall out the board and let that value engine churn that I think it's really going to be an exciting blue finisher. So yeah, cool things. Tundra Explorer, now a 3-cost 3/3. The design notes say that this is specifically to make it a more survivable unit that'll get its top card draw more often. And yeah, that's what's going to happen. It is going to do that more often. You might actually be able to build a Tundra Explorer deck now. It's not going to be a thing that you put down and it just gets immediately killed. and it's going to be something that might actually potentially get attacked. It still doesn't feel great in ranked, I think, due to its just vulnerability to torch, but the overall 3/3 for 3 is just a little bit more like on the side of like getting good card advantage. And this is that Spire Chaplain change as well, right? Like Spire Chaplain is now a 3/3 for 3 as well, and that means that it's much more likely to draw those Justice Sigils. By the same token, Tundra Explorer is going to be much more likely to draw its spells. So I'm pretty excited about this. I don't think I was ever really playing with Tundra Explorer at 2. It just there were too many good cards in that slot, and one of them was Second Sight, which you basically had to have if you had Tundra Explorer. So yeah, I think I like this change. I also like that Tundra Explorer is now a card that actually pressures and deals damage. Like this card is actually kind of threatening now. So it is potentially something you can play down and defend and do some cool things with. It's not something that you're going to be getting immediate card advantage with the way that you would have gone, but I think that that's pretty cool. Yeah, no, so this card, it's never been that exciting for me. The chance of it drawing the top card of your deck is based on like whether or not you build your deck around it, and I think that's really cool, but yeah, overall it's just okay. All right. Rin Reaper, we already covered on Rin Reaper. So Windshaper, now a 4-cost 2/4 instead of a 5-cost 2/5. So much better rate. Still pretty defensible. The amount of health it has is good enough to survive Torch. The difference between 4 and 5 is one of the least important differences in the game. There just aren't that many cards that deal 4 damage directly. And as far as blocking goes, usually you're blocking 3s. You're not blocking 4s as often. It matters in terms of like defending yourself against Dawnwalkers and the like, but in terms of keeping this card out for its effect, I think that a nerf to health does not really change all that much, while a nerf to cost is actually really, really important. So this card could definitely make flying decks an archetype. It's still a very, very strong draft choice, and I think it's an even stronger draft choice now. Yeah, I don't know what to make of this card overall, but I think that the flying unit rate actually is a really good increase, and it should again make like cheap flying decks really, really nice. So you'll notice that most of these changes, I think all of these changes, are rares and uncommons, and that's actually really cool. Oh yeah, there's some legendary nerfs. Oh, and Umbran and Geral Ice Ride as well. So yeah. Okay, so the final one is Withering Witch. Withering Witch got the biggest bat by far. It lost 3 health points, and now it just gives each enemy unit's health 1, and is a 1/1 to immediately block one of those units. I think this is specifically something about a toxic play pattern. Like they were saying that it was just something that was like really, really making problems for like new players. They'd run into Withering Witch, they'd frequently get like beaten down by, I guess, that 1/4, and like as a blocker it just created a situation where, you know, if you're playing an early deck, you don't have a lot of removal, you don't have a lot of ways to kill Withering Witch, so she kind of becomes a blockade that you can't really answer. You're not necessarily going to be running 4 suffocates like everyone is running in the you know, professional circuit. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. I think that overall, like, Withering Witch doesn't change too much here. She still gets to do her thing, set up for that big Black Sky Harbinger kill. She's not as good at like just holding the board afterwards, so she's not an extremely good card on her own, but yeah, she's mostly okay. I think she's probably good enough. Yeah, so that is all of the like major stuff in the patch notes. What's the remaining stuff? Okay, remaining stuff in the patch notes. Theme deck quest update. Players that haven't completed all of their theme deck quests will now have a counter in their quest display to indicate when the next quest will come and what deck they'll receive. I think that was a response to some specific Reddit stuff. The totems can now be purchasable for gems. So if you want to buy the totems for monies, you can certainly do that. They're also a little bit cheaper than they used to be. I think they used to be 7,000 coins, so that's nice. Yeah, let's see here. Totems in Draft and Forge are no longer random, so they'll default to your most recently used totem. That's good news. Draft matchmaking. Players can no longer pair with the same opponent in a single draft run, so you'll no longer run into the same deck twice. Oh, that's interesting. I think that's actually kind of a... As a change, I'm not sure if I care all that much. I think it certainly does suck to run up against the same opponent when you're losing, or when you've lost a game, but it's also sort of a dramatic moment on occasion. Still, it should add for make a little variety happen. I think I'm pretty net neutral on that change. It's altogether pretty good. Okay, various UI improvements and updates throughout the client. That seems fine. Yeah, we got some mild stuff there. If anyone can point out specific things, I'm happy to see them. I don't see anything major. It looks like mostly just like small UI stuff. So looks fine. Resolution settings now is an option for native to your screen. Searching for new in the deck builder will now display all the cards that you own that you haven't seen. So if you have all those shiny cards that you need to mouse over, you can just go into my collection and search for new. And there you go. I can mouse over them all and they're no longer new. Hey! If you don't have advanced deck building on, you'll now get a power count at the bottom of your deck list. Clicking on this will allow you to control the power distribution of your deck. So, let's see here. Oh, that's nice. So, like, even when you have advanced deck building off... I actually missed this. This is a cool change. Which is in gameplay features, by the way. You have advanced deck building off, and you go into a deck. You should have a power count, which you can then customize. That's a really good option to enable, and allows you to like basically just set up your power like you had advanced deck building. So, pretty good deal. I think that's a really nice change, because it allows you to basically like make sure that your power is set up the way that you want it to be. Looks like it doesn't... Oh, wait. There we go. Haha! I guess as soon as you press control your power, it turns advanced deck building on. So, yeah. Not bad, not bad. Okay, so what else? What else? You can now check out the upcoming season rewards from the leaderboards in your profile. They were already available somewhere else, but it looks like you can now look at them here. I'm guessing it's this. Yeah, that little mouse over. Fun things there. I thought you could do that already. If you go to top 100, is it in the leaderboards? Oh, okay. Now you can click here as well and see all of the rewards. Ah, yes. Okay, good, good, good. You can report a player for having an inappropriate username by interacting with their avatar. That's good to know, I guess. I don't know if we have anybody who will actually run into as an inappropriate username, but good to know. Timing out while having attackers declared should now correctly remove the attack blades as the turn passes. Just small bug fixes. UX around A key. Yeah, bug fixes, bug fixes, bug fixes. We don't talk about those any. And Cobalt Countess is now correctly a gunslinger rogue. So she's a roguish gunslinger. And I think there are actually several gunslinger rogues. Yeah, there are two, Bandit Queen and Cobalt Countess. The Cabal is a cabal of gunslinger rogues, apparently. How many rogues are there? Perhaps rogues will matter at some point. Champion of Chaos is a rogue. Everyone in the Cabal is a rogue, and the Praxis Outlaw is a mage rogue. He's a rogue mage, guys. And we also have a Centaur rogue. That's kind of interesting. Alright, alright. Yeah, I think the main thing here is that it makes Kid Chaos, as far as like advanced deck building goes, like the main difference here is that it makes it easier for newbies to find that option, because they weren't finding that option before. That was actually kind of a big deal. So, alright.